We're joined in the studio by Ali Renison, Head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. Welcome to the programme. Remind us and the viewers, what is the Customs Union?
So the Customs Union itself is something that only EU member states can belong to. It means that if you belong to it, the EU negotiates all of your trade agreements on behalf, and they set all of the import tariffs on the member states' behalf. And I think that's why actually it's right to say when we leave the EU, we will be leaving the Customs Union, but there is some discussion to be had about whether a new partial, as we've suggested, or if some want a full comprehensive customs union should take its place.
Right. So do you think that the government's proposals, this idea of the UK collecting tariffs on behalf of the EU, do you think that's workable?
It depends on the timescale. So the Director General of HMRC has said on record publicly several times it would take minimum 5 to 7 years to implement. There have been sort of efforts from HMRC to try and work with parts of the private sector to model these. So I don't think it's totally worth something throwing away, but it does require a very different discussion about what the timescales are needed to make it work.
Right. Well, it wouldn't work, obviously, in the current timetable, would it? Then?
Not under a 2-year time frame. And I think the PM did reflect that in her remarks to the Liaison Committee about different arrangements needing different timescales.
What about the other option that the government has proposed, which is a technological solution, again rejected by the EU?
Well, we don't know if they've wholesale rejected it. We haven't necessarily got into the future framework discussions at that point. There is an issue about whether it totally obviates the need for an actual border on the island of Ireland, and that's the big question, because you can have maximum facilitation, but then it depends on what kind of regulatory arrangements you have first. So to know how much of the heavy lifting technology has to do, you have to know what the future relationship is first.
Right. What's your preferred option, David? You're a Brexit minister.
Well, actually, none of those, really. But I think that probably the one that appeals most is the so-called maximum facilitation model. But Ali's absolutely right. It's not just a question of customs. It's also a question of regulation on both sides of the border. And accepting EU regulation, of course, again dilutes the extent to which we've left the European Union. Right.
And when you say none of these really are your preferred option, what is your preferred option?
Well, I think that we need a free trade agreement with the European Union. And I think that that's something that we need to discuss with them very quickly. At the moment, of course, the European Union is putting discussion about free trade agreements very much on the back burner until the issue of, for example, the border between Northern and Southern Ireland is resolved. But I do think that a free trade agreement is the preferred option, which of course would preserve the ability of the United Kingdom to strike free trade agreements with third countries outside the EU.
So what we've suggested is something that would not only minimise the cost to manufacturers, but also allow the UK to pursue free trade agreements. The customs union itself, the EU's customs union, does prevent you striking those deals. But if you have a partial customs union, so it's limited in scope to, say, industrial goods, then you have plenty of leverage to actually negotiate on things like agricultural tariffs and many other areas in trade agreements.
Right, and what gives you such confidence that there is that leverage, that it exists?
Because there is a precedent for it, even if it's not desirable in its current form, which is the Turkish customs union, in terms of it provides a precedent to say we can have a partial scope customs union as part of a wider FTA, so a hybrid model, so to speak. And what would need to be negotiated, which the EU is supposedly open to, is giving the UK more of an input into those areas where it cuts the tariffs that are covered by that partial customs union.
Are you reassured that the government, that Theresa May, is going to stick to your party's policy, which is to leave the customs union?
Yes, I am, because she's restated that repeatedly, and several times this week, as a matter of fact. And I think that she recognises that remaining in the customs union is something that is completely off the agenda. Not least, of course, because if we remain in the customs union, we effectively have not left the European Union.
Right. If she were to bend, if she were to be defeated, if the government was defeated on a key motion or an amendment that's coming up in the next month or so on whether to remain in a customs union or not, what would she do?
Well, I don't believe that that's going to happen. I actually believe that the House will vote to leave the customs union. I think that what we're seeing at the moment is the last-ditch attempt on the part of the Remainers to ensure that we don't really leave the European Union, and I'm pretty confident that that will be defeated when the vote does come. Not today's vote, by the way, which is frankly a pretty meaningless vote.
And we'll come on to that in just a moment. Do you think Brussels, it is a negotiation after all, will yield on this issue, the partial customs union or whatever it is going to be called, in order to solve the issue of Northern Ireland and that free-flowing trade, and in order for the government to keep to its stated policy?
I think there's a sequencing issue. So at the moment, what they're trying to get through is the backstop as part of the withdrawal agreement, which has, at the moment, Northern Ireland only basically effectively remaining aligned to the entirety of the customs union and most of the single market. So I think that when it comes to the actual future trade agreement, they might consider it, but the UK would effectively have to ask for that arrangement first.
All right, thank you, but stay with us. The motion being debated that David just mentioned actually in the Commons today calls for an establishment of an effective customs union after Brexit. One of the MPs putting their name to it is the Conservative, Sarah Wollaston, and she joins us now. Sarah, what's the point of it? It's not binding. Tories have been asked and told to abstain, so it's pointless.
No, it's not pointless. It allows people to express their feelings about the debate, because this is not just about free trade agreements. This is about frictionless trade. It's about jobs and investment and supply chains. And just take the work that my committee's been doing around supply chains, looking at the very complex chains that apply to medicines, devices and blood products, for example. We could end up seeing, irrespective of all the deals that go on, very serious problems with the supply chains of medicines.
Right. Is Theresa May wrong about the customs union?
I think that I would agree that we need to have a different kind of customs union, one that applies to goods, as we've just been hearing, and there are precedents for having that. But what we're calling for is something that's effective, and by effective, I mean one that doesn't lead to serious delays at borders and seriously disrupt inward investment and lead to loss of jobs, and that's what this is about. And as I say, disruptions in the supply chain of really important things like medicines.
What do you say to Brexiteers like David Jones who say that this is a last-ditch attempt by Remainers like you to thwart Brexit?
No, we've accepted that Britain has voted to leave. This is about the type of Brexit. I think that a hard, cliff-edge, walk-away Brexit would be immensely damaging, not only to our economy, but have really serious implications for individuals. As I say, I used to find sometimes when I was in practice as a doctor, occasionally there'd be a problem with a batch and there'd be terrible supply chain problems with an individual drug. It happened very occasionally. If there are serious hold-ups in the supply chain, and these are very complex integrated supply chains, we would see that happening on a massive scale, and that would really hit individuals.
But this is a central plank, though, of the government's Brexit policy, to leave the customs union, to strike free trade deals. It was one of the main reasons Theresa May said that the country would be able to do its own thing when it came to trade. So when the issues of the withdrawal bill and the trade bills come back to the Commons, not today's vote, when they come back to the Commons and there is a motion and an amendment to say that Britain should stay in a customs union or an effective customs union, will you vote against the government?
Well, I think the point is there isn't a parliamentary majority for a hard Brexit. That is simply the case, and that is well recognised. So the point is, can we actually use this as an opportunity to persuade the government to come to a compromise position, which is around having an effective customs union, not the one that we have at the moment, but something that allows frictionless trade. That
will
matters.
You vote against the government, though?
As I say, we need to see where we get to when it comes back. I understand that it's now possibly going to be pushed back to the autumn, and that gives a bit more time for negotiations to proceed. All of us want to come to an arrangement that is the best for all of our constituents, but that allows free trade, frictionless trade. And as others have said, the current arrangements could end up with us swapping the equivalent of a three-course meal for a promise of a packet of crisps later. I mean, we're not going to replace what we already have with all of these trade deals. The prospectus has been oversold, and we're sort of coming up here with Brexit reality. And that's what we're discussing today, because there's been considerable work by a number of select committees that has set out some of the unintended consequences. So that's why we're debating it today.
I'm going to let you go because I think you're going back to the debate. Sarah Wollaston, thank you very much. Listening to that, Ali Renison, what is the solution here? Because we've just heard from Sarah Wollaston, the prospectus for Brexit has been oversold. It will disrupt supply chains for important, critical things like medicines. Are those not good reasons to vote to stay in a customs union?
Well, I think people have to understand that it's not necessarily actually an either-or choice, and I hate to make a sort of a big song and dance about the indefinite article, but a new customs union that is limited in scope allows you to do trade agreements and keep the trade friction to a minimum. So I think it's very important. It's not necessarily the either-or that some people are making out.
Do you trust Sarah Wollaston and your other Tory colleagues who have said the prospectus has been oversold about what it can bring to actually vote with the government at those key votes in June?
I think what they ought to remember is that this country voted in 2016 to leave the European Union. Now, being in the European Union comprehends being subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, being part of the single market, and also being part of the customs union. The country has voted to leave the EU, and therefore we have to leave all those arrangements.
Would it be a betrayal if we don't?
I believe that we ought to make sure that we keep faith with the electorate, and keeping faith with the electorate means leaving the European Union. But I was interested to hear what Ali had to say about the Turkish precedent. Of course, the problem with Turkey is that Turkey is a rule taker. Turkey takes the rules that are established by the European Union. And I don't think that a country such as the UK really wants to be in the position that Turkey is. And trade is hardly frictionless. I think that if you cross the border between the EU and Turkey, you will see long queues of lorries waiting to be processed.
Ali Renison, we've run out of time, but thank you very much for coming in. Ha!